everyone, welcome to my fourth video here in our Sumsub expert channel. My name is Natalia, I'm Sumsub's AI compliance specialist, and today my mission here is to unpack a little bit the year of 2024, which is a year that has been a little bit crazy, some would say. We have in this year two dynamics that kind of happen separately, but pretty much intertwined at many points. So on the one hand, we have the rise of deepfakes, with AI technologies being more and more popularized. Now it's very easy for everyone to create and disseminate their own deepfakes. And on the other hand, we also had in 2024 the biggest electoral year in history, with the population of over 60 countries heading to the ballots. Like I said, those two things didn't happen separately, but actually interacted during the whole year. So, for example, in January 2024, we had a case of a deepfake video featuring President Joe Biden, where he seemed to be urging US voters to skip the primary elections. At the same time, in February 2024, there was a deepfake featuring the very popular pop singer Taylor Swift, in a way that her words were weaponized in order to influence political discourse. So, how to make sense of all of this? Has the threats of deepfakes actually had the expected impact in the electoral cycle in 2024? Or were we too pessimistic about it? What have countries done to regulate this to some extent? Or what have they not done? And what about tech companies? These are just some of the questions that I want to make sense of today, but this time I won't be doing this alone. This time I have with me Raymond, who is joining us all the way from Sydney. And well, we are going to have this interview with him. Hi Raymond, how are you doing?
Hi Natalia, and thank you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks very much for being here. A quick intro about Raymond. Raymond is both a tech lawyer, so a lawyer specialized in technology regulations, but also a developer. So like I would say, you would have the best of both worlds. And not only that, but Raymond is the mastermind behind the creation of the Global AI Regulation Tracker, which is a tool available for free on the internet in which you can see all the AI regulations, AI policies that every single country in the world has been pursuing in the last years. I know that nowadays there are so many trackers around there on the internet, but I like to think that Raymond is a little bit of the OG when it comes to trackers. It's so intuitive. And it's been there for such a long time before it was hyped, I would say. So yeah, for me, it's a huge pleasure to have again the mastermind behind it here talking to me today. How did you come up with the idea actually to have the tracker? How did you start transitioning your career a little bit towards this topic of AI regulations, also deepfake regulations? If you could tell us a little bit of your history as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that a grand intro, Natalia. I'm feeling a bit, blushed from that, but yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah, my journey in AI has started pretty early. It started with actually just coding. Ever since I was a kid, I was always fascinated with robots and AI, and I've always tried to work somewhere within tech. And during high school, because I enjoyed playing computer games, that's how I also picked up coding as a hobby to also try to build my own computer games. And so I've been coding since my high school days, building my own games and building my own websites. I've been continuing that even till today. I got into AI because during my university days, so I studied a law degree, but during the holidays, I had time to just build more things. And I was really interested in learning machine learning, especially around image recognition. So we're talking about, days before ChatGPT, where machine learning was still a pretty geeky niche topic. And I was learning sort of the theory in the background, but what was the key turning point was during COVID when it was lockdown. And one of my other hobbies was dance classes, but I couldn't attend dance classes anymore. So I thought, since I'm already learning machine learning, why why can't I just build an app that sort of uses AI to analyze my dance moves? And so that was sort of my holiday project during that time. I built an app that you basically upload a video of yourself dancing and then compare your dance video against the original dance video, and it will show you how similar you dance to the original video in terms of statistics, and also show you screenshots of where you could improve. I vlogged that entire process and I put it on YouTube, and it went pretty viral. And then I applied that algorithm to K-pop dancers and dance videos, and that got even more viral throughout Asia. And that was sort of my key, also stepping stone into just social media in general. That inspired me to go on LinkedIn and also to not just post my AI projects, but as someone who's interested in, history, geography, and geopolitics, I naturally was interested in regulation and ultimately AI regulation. And we're talking about, 2020 and 2021. So like AI regulation was still very much a new topic. And so there wasn't that much going on. I just kept some notes. I had a notebook where I just recorded my thoughts and my findings on particular AI regulation topics until after, let's say, 2 years, my notebook started to get filled out, and I realized actually this could be published in some way. Um, so I thought, why not create a website that sort of shows and summarizes AI regulations around the world? And so, being a developer myself, I could build a website. So I just did that, and I launched it in middle of last year. And yeah, I was very, very grateful to have a lot of positive feedback and use by people around the world. Until this day, it's still running, updated every day, and I've added new features to further support anyone's, whether it be research or whether it be trying to look up new laws, sort of like a community tool.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's very impressive. And I think I can say we are all very grateful that during the pandemic, you spent your time refining your skills instead of, learning how to bake sourdough. We are all using the global AI regulation tracker. So yeah, thanks again so much. And let's go a bit deeper into it now, and more specifically the topic of our talk. So like I said in the introduction, at the beginning of this year, there was a lot of pessimism about how and if deepfakes that now are so popularized would interfere in the election cycle. I think here in Sumsub, we're especially tuned into this debate because as we are working in the market of fraud prevention, we see deepfakes on a daily basis. And when we monitor these fraud trends, we can spot that deepfakes has been increasing the amount of them in a staggering way. So I would like to know your general opinion about it. This anticipated deepfake doomsday, deepfake politics doomsdays, has it materialized as predicted?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. For me, I see deepfakes as the next level of misinformation and disinformation, which was already a huge topic during the social media era. So, when the social media era started in the 2000s, there was a lot of excitement around connecting people around the world, but there was also a lot of concern and fear around both scams, also a lot of misinformation being pushed out on these platforms. And so that sort of risk has been around for a long time, but deepfakes has really elevated that to the next level because one, it produces really hyper realistic content, which seems very real, but is in fact not real. And that carries an even higher fraud, scam, and just general misinformation risk. And 2024 is a big year because of many elections around the world. And ever since the social media era, you know, e- elections are now very much intertwined in not just the analog world, but also the digital world, where a lot of campaigns are being run online, not just on the ground. And so when you have platforms and online platforms playing a big role in elections around the world, naturally deepfakes and just other misinformation sort of issues will have a huge role, and it's a huge red flag and gray area that has really been a core focus of these election years. So That's sort of how I see it. It's just an extension of misinformation risk.
I think that makes perfect sense. So it is a new phenomenon, but also not entirely new. It's something that has been threatening us and has been around for some time already. And we talked a little bit about the potential negative consequences of deepfakes. And I wanted to maybe investigate, what do you think, if there is any positive cases of it? So I give you one example. I know there was elections in India this year, and in India, candidates have used AI-powered avatars to engage with individual citizens in an electorate that is huge, right? We are talking about like 900 million registered votes. And such very hyper-personalized engagement, it is believed to enhance candidates' political appeal. It can bring the political elites closer to the population. But on the other hand, it can be understood as intrusive or manipulative even. So what do you think about this? Do you think there's any way that we can use deepfakes to maybe enhance the democratic process? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Personally, I find there are more political risks than political benefits to deepfakes. But that's not to say that there are no sort of beneficial use cases of deepfakes. Just generally speaking, I see there are three key positive use cases from deepfakes. Number one is just the idea of synthetic data. And this goes hand in hand with privacy concerns. So often, a big issue with AI is that, especially AI that's trained on personal data, you have to comply with privacy laws. And if you don't, you're in breach of privacy laws and you violate privacy rights. So deepfakes have been sort of a innovative workaround those privacy issues by, for example, let's say you're trying to build a facial recognition system that needs to be trained on lots of face data. Instead of having to use real life face images, which would trigger a lot of privacy issues, you can use deepfakes to generate a huge volume of fake face data, but they still look realistic enough to be used as training material. And there you can train your AI on that synthetic face data and sort of achieve similar training effects. Obviously, that cuts into IP issues and the like, and also just general misinformation issues, but I'll set that to one side. But that's like the first positive bucket. The second bucket has been, for the content, media, entertainment industry. I know a lot of, filmmakers, the editing community are using deepfakes to really speed up their content production processes. So that has provided a huge productivity benefit. And the third positive use case is also helping people relive the past in a way. So I know there are some companies and some tools out there that try to create deep fakes of past relatives who are already deceased, and they're able to regenerate memories. Static photos can now become videos, and you can able to relive memories through just a static image. And so that has an emotional and also in some ways spiritual uh, in significance to those users. So these are the broad positive use cases that we often talk about for deepfakes. But in the political context, it's a bit hard to detect what that positive use case is unless it falls within one of those three buckets that I just described. So I think right now a lot of the attention is really just trying to limit the negative impacts of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think your answer really speaks to this duality of technologies, right? They can be deployed for the good and for the bad. So it's up to us, up to policymakers to see how we make sense out of those things. And in this sense, you also talked a lot in the beginning about how deepfakes is just a next level stage of some of the problems that we are already countering in social media when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, all types of fake news. And I wanted to have a look a little bit before we jumping into talk to regulations, talk a little bit about private actors and what they have been doing or not doing when it comes to contain a little bit the spread and threats of deepfakes. So I know, for example, that at the beginning of this year, there was the Munich Tech Accord, right? So it was an accord that was signed by many big tech companies, so ranging all the way from Google, IBM to OpenAI, TikTok. The problem is that upon closer examination of this accord and the subsequent actions taken by these firms, what we have is a very complex tapestry of the commitments and capabilities of these actors to enforce them. So I wanted to know, how do you perceive actions taken by these big techs? So in general, were they enough? And if not, in which instances do you think did they fall short?
That's a very good question. So I often like to think about first principles. What are the key interests and drivers that drive the actions of a particular actor? Um, with just any standard big tech company or any platform that has the potential or role to distribute and facilitate the distribution of deepfakes, often the key commercial driver is profit, and how they make profit is normally based on usage, user retention, making sure that people stay on the platform so that the ads can run on that platforms, and that's how you make ad revenue. So it's not rocket science, hopefully, but that's sort of the key business model for these sort of platforms. And so when it comes to trying to control conduct around deepfakes, or measures around deepfakes, right now what we've seen a lot, and as you already mentioned, it's mostly based on self-regulation, and we're trying to in many cases trying to reuse some of the ideas that we took from the social media era and apply it now to the AI era. And most of these measures are based on voluntary code of conduct, where you're just relying on private actors to sort of be honest and try to at their own cost implement measures to control certain risks. But often these measures are at odds with the commercial and business model. So that's not to say that none of them haven't done nothing. Most of the big tech platforms have implemented a level of measures to try to control misinformation generally, and by extension deepfakes. I think the real question is, it's not so much are they doing enough, it's more around what is the penalty or sanction if they fall behind those measures. And the concept of penalties and sanctions is no longer an issue of voluntariness, but an issue of hard regulation. That's like the key. That's like the ultimate material difference between voluntary standards and hard regulation. It's the significance and enforceability of sanctions and punitive actions, and that's a huge debate still. Particularly in many countries where free speech either has a huge cultural significance or a legal significance. For example, in the US, the constitutional right of free speech. Any sort of regulation that attempts to curtail, whether it be the creation, distribution of content, you have to think about whether that cuts across those free speech protections. So I can go to a lot of the sort of the legal factors and structures around that, but that's sort of the general tension we've seen so far. It's a question of, should we enforce hard penalties around shortcomings in measures to tackle deepfake risk.
Okay, interesting. So a little bit more about this conundrum between, so far we have been relying on codes of conduct. That reminds me of the EU code of conduct, where some companies, big companies, pledged to combat fake news, misinformation in general. And now this code of conduct is actually being, to some extent, enforced by the DSA, which comes with its own enforcement rules, which includes huge fines, so on and so forth. So maybe talking a little bit about the EU now, which is this jurisdiction with a very robust regulatory framework, especially when we are talking about tech regulation. The EU also had elections this year, right? We have parliamentary elections this summer. Do you think, in general, we can say that the DSA showed some efficacy on on handling deepfakes in a context of elections, because I think it's worth mentioning the DSA, it was approved, it was in general idealized in an area that maybe deepfakes were not the threat that they are nowadays. But by the time the European elections happened, the EU AI Act was also not even in place. So at the end of the day, my question is, all these big regulations we have in the EU have been then put into use, especially when we talk about deepfakes in this context of elections?
Yeah, I think the short answer is it's still too early to say because it's quite recent. But in principle, I think the intention is noble, and hopefully it does work to control risks. But I see the DSA is only one piece of the puzzle. Uh, so just taking a bit of a bigger picture, when it comes to trying to regulate deep fakes, you, off, you have to think about tackling it from uh, four angles. One is the creation of the deep fake, and that's on the developer side. Second is the distribution of that deep fake, which is where social media platforms come in. The third angle is regulating, not regulating, but more so protecting victims of deepfakes. So if you've been caught by a deepfake scam or you've been subject of a deepfake fraud, what are your remedies as the victim? So that's a third area. And then the fourth area is sort of agnostic to those three, but it's more around expanding existing regulatory powers, whether it be greater powers to do investigations or greater powers to hand down penalties within the existing jurisdictions in order to sort of control that risk. So that's how I see the four pillars of deepfake regulation from like a legal perspective. The DSA mostly falls within the second bucket, which is the distribution side. But that's only, again, 1/4 of the picture, or actually arguably two-fourth, because you have the regulatory powers being amended in that sense too. But another key area, which I don't think the DSA is designed to target, which is the first area, which is around the creation and just the general transparency requirements that needs to be embedded within synthetic content generally. But that's where the EU AI Act kind of sort of fills that gap. When I'm sure we'll talk about that in more depth. But in short, the DSA alone can't solve the entire problem. It's got to be in conjunction with a lot of other laws. And I'm not just talking about tech-specific laws. We also need to consider how it aligns with the GDPR, also copyright directives, and also just general consumer protection laws, and to some extent, maybe even the product liability directive, which just was published in the journal, I think, this week, to the extent that the content does end up in some sort of regulated product. So we need to think about the collection of these laws and how they target each of those pillars that I just mentioned.
Interesting. I would like to follow up to one of the things you mentioned. And like you said, we're going to talk more about the EU AI Act. So let's talk more about the EU AI Act. When it comes to deepfakes, indeed, what I think strikes the most about the newly AI regulation in the EU is the transparency requirements that it sets. What do you think of them? Are they enough? Because I think they fall short to some extent in many ways. They are not clear. So, for example, you already mentioned that in societies where freedom of speech has a big weight in how we take decisions, right? That it is more difficult to regulate deepfakes. And when it comes to that, the EU AI Act is a bit unclear. It sets exemptions to the transparency requirements, but not very clearly, I would say. What do you think of all of this? How suitable is the EU AI Act in the deepfake fight, let's say?
So regardless of whether we're talking about the EU AI Act or any other sort of deepfake regulation that primarily relies on transparency measures to sort of control the risk, I think these transparency measures are sort of the best that we have so far in terms of the state of the technology. So, like, just thinking back to first principles, how do you, from a practical perspective, how do you protect people from malicious deepfakes? That's really the core question here. You either, curtail its development so that the tool itself can't produce a malicious deepfake. We're seeing that sort of happening, but as we see with, stories of people jailbreaking tools and using prompts to trick the AI to produce something that is not supposed to do it, it's very hard to absolutely ensure that tools don't create malicious deepfakes. So that's one live practical issue. So if we can't solve that right now, really the only other option is um, empowering the victim or empowering the user to be aware of whether the content they're seeing is fake or not. And that's where the whole idea of transparency comes in. But there's a spectrum of transparency requirements, ranging from transparency that is in the form of, let's just say, a watermark. So if you just slap on a warning, slap on disclaimer, or some logo onto the content to say that this was AI generated. So that's sort of like the light version of transparency. The middle step is something that's a sort of a cross between transparency and technicality, which is around metadata. So requiring social media platforms to either embed certain metadata into synthetic content so that that content, regardless of where it appears, it will have some sort of indicator in there that suggests that's AI generated. But that's a very big technical sort of a challenge, and it requires interoperability between platforms, which again, that's very hard to achieve in sync. And then the third sort of ultimate transparency goal, which is really uh, uplifting transparency into some sort of licensing regime or consent regime, where in order for you to be able to release deepfake content or to provide a tool that creates deepfake content, you need to be licensed from the state in order to do that. Not many jurisdictions have gone with that, with a full-fledged licensing regime yet. India is looking into it, and China is sort of close to that, but it's not a licensing regime exactly. It's more of a registration and approval regime than a license regime. But that's basically a way to say that the transparency is a full spectrum. Now, where the EU AI Act sits in is probably more on the lighter end of the transparency spectrum. But the key thing to note that is that deepfakes are not just subject to transparency obligations under the EU AI Act. The transparency obligations, just to clear one big misconception, it's often known as the limited risk category that we often see. But the term limited risk is actually not a actual term in the EA Act. It's more just a reference to those Article 50 transparency obligations. And those transparency obligations are not mutually exclusive to the other obligations that apply to high risk systems as well as general purpose AI models. They can apply in addition to those other rules. So let's say you're seeking to provide a deep fake model. You have to comply with both the transparency obligations as well as the general purpose AI model obligations to the extent that your model fits in that category. So I guess my main point is that transparency itself has a lot of nuances, but it should not be the focal area as the only source of like regulatory control around deepfake. You have to think about how it interacts with other provisions in the act or other acts in general.
Okay, definitely learned a lot with your answer now. Let me structure everything, but I find very useful the four-step recipe, as to say, of the angles we gotta look into when we want to think about deepfake regulation, and especially how transparency is an entire spectrum in itself. And then when talking about transparency, you mentioned some different things that countries like India and China are doing. And maybe I would like to hear a little bit more about what actually these countries are doing in terms of deepfake regulations. I know that China, for example, has its own deep synthesis regulation that came a little bit before than any other, so that's interesting. And how is that regulation being currently enforced? Is there any expectations for it to be amended somehow to keep up with technological advances, and what India is doing as well?
I'll talk about China, India, and I'll also make a mention of South Korea, because South Korea is also one of the more leading front runners in malicious deepfake regulation. So China, yeah, as you mentioned, it's one of the early jurisdictions that already has enforced laws around AI. But unlike the European Union, which has just one act to regulate the AI sector generally, the Chinese approach is to regulate specific domains of AI on a case by case basis. So currently, they've got laws regulating recommendation algorithms. They've also got laws regulating deep synthesis content, which is their phrase for synthetic content, which will cover deepfakes. And they've also got a law on generative AI, which will cover your chatbots and the like. And so the core theme of Chinese laws is that they're focusing on AI that pose the most misinformation risk. Those three areas I just mentioned are the closest to generating misinformation and disinformation. So they've been the priority areas for the Chinese government. At the same time, so out of these three, it's the deep synthesis law that has the most relevance to deep fakes. But across all these three laws, they sort of share into the same mechanism. And there's a term I like to use, which is called regulation scalability or scalable regulation, which is to say that the Chinese approach, they basically, in a way, copy and pasted one law to the next when it comes to regulating AI. All three laws require some sort of pre-deployment security assessment check. They also require content moderation metrics, and they also require registration. And so all three of them apply these same mechanisms. So when it comes to a deep synthesis provider, they're pretty much subject to the similar regulations as to someone who's trying to provide a recommendation algorithm. So that's sort of the high level legal requirements. But these legal requirements really only take up, let's say, half the equation. The other half are the security standards. And that's probably one of the more unique factors of the Chinese AI regulatory system. It's not so much the much of protection is not so much in the regulation, but in the standards. And the Chinese body, so there are actually multiple bodies who are working on AI related standards. And there's a bunch of them that relate to synthetic content. And these sort of standards kind of cover the whole spectrum of the transparency measures that I just mentioned previously. You've got specific templates, specific formats on notices, watermarks, logos, metadata. You even got samples of like what should the JSON file look like for your metadata. So they're very specific on these sort of standards, and that's pretty characteristic of Chinese laws. The high level regulation tends to be very high level and abstract in some way, but the standards go really deep into the detail, and those two together provide a lot of certainty in a way, regulatory certainty for the market or what to do and what you can't do. And so far, so these laws have been in place for 1 to 2 years now. And every quarter, AI apps have to go for approval of the Chinese regulator, specifically the Cyberspace Administration. They basically approve batches of apps every quarter. So that's been quite consistent. And so right now, all the AI tools that I see in China have been assessed by the government in some way. And so you have that level of assurance that, okay, this wasn't something that it just didn't go through the checks. It did go through some checks. So that's the one thing. And there's also a lot of offenses, penalties for those who try to use synthetic content to not just create offensive material, but to also harm social interests and community interests. And there are pretty harsh penalties for that. So you have that deterrence effect also regulating conduct. So I'd say China's way of regulating AI and just deepfakes is quite mature compared to many other jurisdictions. India, on the other hand, is still trying to work its way through. And over the past 2 or 3 years, the Indian government has sort of switched tracks on how it should approach regulation. Last year, they were saying that they don't want to regulate AI, or they're not considering AI regulation because they want to sort of promote innovation. But this year, given the election year and a lot of concerns around misinformation and the risks to democracy, there's been a huge push towards regulating deepfake risk. No, no actual law yet, but probably one of the biggest developments was when the India's Ministry of Electronics and IT, they've sent a circular notice to the big tech companies to tell them that, hey, if you're trying to beta test or trial an AR product out to the market, you gotta get a government permission. And so, just trying to refer back to my previous answers, this is an example of targeting the social media or the distribution angle. And this is also using the permissions model from the spectrum measures to sort of regulate that deepfake risk. So that's an example of what India is doing. But the interesting thing about India is that AI is not the only regulation that they're thinking about. They've also recently gone through the privacy law reform. They're also thinking about reforming the IT Act and upgrading it into something called the Digital India Act. So there's a huge tech law reform happening in India. So basically, I guess that's my general comment. um, it's often easy to just focus on AI regulation in one country, see what to do with that space, and then make a sort of value judgment to say that, oh, if they're not doing enough in AI regulation, it means that they don't care about AI risks. That's not the case. You have to think about what other law reforms they're doing around generally, and then you can make a assessment, okay, how they're approaching AI, whether it's from a specific or broad lens. And finally, just a quick mention of South Korea. South Korea is an example of a country that's using the criminal law rather than the civil law to really regulate deepfakes. In Korea, there's been a pretty systemic, maybe not systemic, but there's a pretty widespread issue of people using malicious deepfakes, especially sexually abusive deepfakes. And the Korean government recently has really stepped in to create laws that impose heavy imprisonment penalties for those who not just create and distribute deepfakes, but also consume these sort of malicious deepfakes. So again, going back to the angles, it's it's adding protections to the victim, but also extend it in a way that even if you're watching these sort of sexually explicit deepfakes, you're going to be criminalized under the law. So that's an example of of South Korea's approach. And based on the recent news statements and just press releases, they're also looking to further expand those laws to cover even further acts around malicious deepfakes. And the Korean model is sort of being seen also in the UK and Australia. UK and Australia are also two other examples where they're using the criminal law to regulate deepfakes. So sort of a long answer, but that's sort of the nuances between those three different systems.
No, no, that was great. No worries. What actually it made me think is that we have so many interesting things happening in so many different countries. And I would like to know if you believe there is any common overarching principle or way of regulation that countries can learn from each other, because of course countries have their different legal traditions, different political and social preferences, and I cannot expect the Chinese model to fit perfectly into what Australia is doing or what the EU is doing and vice versa. But is there any shared commonality that you see amongst these different countries and they can learn from each other?
Yeah, I think there is commonality in two aspects. One is just AI ethics. I think 4 or 5 years ago, we're still debating on what is AI ethics, what should be the ethical principles for AI. But today, I think there is already a universal consensus on what those ethics should be. For example, transparency, accountability, human in the loop, um, respecting privacy, respecting IP. So these sort of principles are already enshrined in a lot of international documents, including the United Nations General Assembly resolution, United Nations Security Council, the UNSCO. They've also got their own recommendations on AI ethics. And a lot of these ethics, they might have different terminology in each country, but the substance is pretty much well adopted around the world. So that's one area of commonality. And obviously, these AI ethics would apply to deepfakes as a subcategory of AI. The second big area of sort of commonality is standards. So a lot of AI standards are out there, including the probably the more well known ones are the ISO 42001, the NIST standards produced in America. So a lot of AI standards are out there that companies and organizations can adopt voluntarily. And every new standard that's been produced basically has an alignment with previous standards. So there's a lot of alignment there. But as I sort of said before, there's a key difference between standards and regulations. Standards are more on the operational, technical, practical side, but the regulation wrapper around those standards very different. And at this stage, I didn't see much commonality. The I guess the key factors of divergence is number one, is the country a civil law system, a common law system, or a Sharia law system? That has a huge impact on how AI ethics and standards are interpreted in the law. The second question is, how mature is the AI industry in that country? Countries, for example, which already have a very mature and very strong AI industry tend to be more specific and surgical in the approach. So, for example, US and China, the big two AI powerhouses, they tend to favor regulations that target specific domains rather than across the board AI regulation, in contrary to the EU and like Canada. So that's the second big question. And then the third big question is just how mature is that country's other tech sector laws, including privacy and IP. So again, going back to the example of India, India is in the process of going through its privacy and other digital economy laws. So that in itself is co- covering the ground for AI. You also have countries like Vietnam, Congo, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, which are thinking about broad technology law. So I'm talking about a tech law act rather than an AI act. And that tech law sort of act covers AI within its subsections. So you have that approach. Um, and then, yeah, so that's sort of like how does it interact with other laws? And the fourth big factor is just the regulatory practice and constitutional considerations. So again, as I mentioned, free speech. The free speech protection in America is, if you look at the history of past bill proposals, all of them contain some sort of carve out or some sort of exemption to address the free speech protection. So American laws can't fully regulate content because of that particular amendment, compared to, let's say, in Australia, where there is actually no express constitutional right to free speech. There is one limited version called the implied protection of political communication, but that's much more limited than a free speech protection. And so Australian laws around content and deepfake uh, tend to be a bit more progressive compared to American bills. So that's an example of structural factors being huge. And also yeah, the enforcement practices. So how well funded the regulator is, the talent and skills of the regulator, also the role of the courts. In common law jurisdictions, the courts have a greater role in shaping the law through the interpretations and the judgments. And often, like in common law systems, criminal law, tort law, fraud, negligence, IP are rooted mostly in the common law rather than the statutory law. And so when you're in those jurisdictions, when it comes to deep fake regulation, you have to also look at how the courts have applied or interpreted certain laws in that space to inform your understanding of what's being regulated. So that's another huge challenge. So again, another long answer to say that there are some things that are common, but right now there's a lot of differences due to structural factors. Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of differences that we do not necessarily see go away in the near future. And already coming a little bit to the end of our interview, sadly, I think we mentioned the US a couple of times in this last answer of yours, right? We talk about the NIST framework, about the challenges and possibilities for regulating deepfakes and AI engineering in the US. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the US now in this last question because, well, it's a country that had major elections this year and is also a country that, even though on the federal level, we don't see any enacted AI regulations or like even deepfake regulations, but on a state level, states have been very active. You have a deepfake regulations ranging from states that are in the different opposite sides of the political spectrum. So you have deepfakes regulation in California all the way to Texas. And how do you perceive those regulations in this electoral year? Did they have a role to play in it and the overall US perception of it?
Yeah, I think there was a huge correlation between the election year and just the deepfake regulation space in the US. Just based on what I've seen this year, we saw like a lot of new AI bills being proposed in the federal level, and a huge chunk of those bills were related to deepfakes, or if not deepfakes, they're relating to synthetic content or um, the idea of digital rights. So, creating rights to your voice and face. So actually, that's also a nice angle. So deepfakes, you can regulate it from deepfake specifically, or you can regulate synthetic content, or you can approach it from a rights perspective where you establish rights in your face and voice, and anyone who tries to create a deep fake of that is infringing on those rights unless they have your consent. So we see these different models being proposed at the federal level of the US, but all of them have run into the whole constitutional free speech issue, and none of them have yet passed through into law, at least at this time of recording. So the federal level is still seeing a lot of stalemate in that area. The states, though, have done a lot more progress, but again, it's a patchwork. I think probably one of the more notable ones is Tennessee. So Tennessee, they've got signed into law a regulation that protects sort of artists' rights, and that, in by extension, protects them from non-consensual deepfakes and synthetic content. And that's rooted in the fact that Tennessee has a pretty vibrant music industry. And so the industry base of a particular US state does have a huge impact on its regulatory agenda. Compare that to California, where actually California recently, I think it was last month, they've signed into like 8 or 16 different new laws around AI. A lot of them were around trying to limit the misinformation risk on AI and making sure it doesn't hamper elections. So there are a bunch of bills around that. And there are also a lot of bills around AI models. Probably one of the more notable ones was SB 1047, which was vetoed by the state governor that attempted to regulate advanced foundation models that could pose sort of like existential risks to humanity. So that's been one of the bigger focuses in the California side. And you have also like the other states like Colorado, Maryland, New York, that sort of sit in between that spectrum of models. So yeah, US is it's very hard to track, honestly. It's the division of powers between federal and state does create sort of a natural and structural misalignment, or sort of a mismatch in laws. I think it will be very interesting to see what the second Trump administration would do in the area of deepfake regulation. But I'm I'm optimistic because based on the current bills around deepfakes, there have been bills proposed by both parties as well as both houses of Congress. So it's not just specific to one party or one house. But I am also conscious that a lot of bills were introduced this year, bills of election year, and it might be that certain uh, politicians wanted to produce a bill just to be seen as someone who's active in the deepfake regulation. But once election year's over, that motivation might be killed and we might see slower progress. So it's really hard to say. But yeah, US is definitely a wild card in this space.
It is, and I think you touched an interesting point, which kind of bridges me a little bit into my last question, which is this year we saw, because of the elections, many incumbents being kicked out. You have a change of government in the US and the UK, many others, but I'm mentioning this too because the new elected presidents and prime ministers, in the case of the UK, they represent what we expect to be a change in how the country regulates AI. Maybe more in the case of the UK, which so far has been had a wait-and-see approach, and now under the Labour government we expect to see more activity. In the case of the US, I don't know how drastic the change will be, but Trump has already said he might repeal Biden's AI executive order, which so far has been the most significant policy, let's say, in terms of AI in the US. So looking a little bit ahead, how can we account for these changes and also think a little bit this year? We talked a lot about deepfakes regulation and AI regulation and elections. I mean, we are doing this interview here for a really long time. I have so many questions. And where do you see us going now? Do you think the fact that we talked so much about these things will result maybe in better regulations, or if not better, at least more regulations when it comes to deepfakes in the future? And how to account a little bit for all these government changes?
I think there is already a positive change in thinking around AI regulation generally. I think the thinking by governments is now starting to become more nuanced. Like 3 years ago, when we say AI regulation, most people just think about regulating the development of AI. And that particular angle, you might have often heard, the whole debate of regulation versus innovation. That sort of debate is really only relevant if you're trying to just regulate the development of AI and the commercialization of AI. But right now, like, especially since when people start to study what's happening in Asia and the global south, we start to see many different models and many different nuanced understandings to regulating AI, not just from development perspective, but as I said, using the criminal law or adding new human rights so that it protects you from infringement that could be caused by AI, or expanding on privacy, or using more informal methods. For example, circular notices. That's been quite a popular technique used in India and Indonesia and Malaysia. So we started to see more nuanced techniques. And so when it comes to this, say the US, sure, like actually for any country where the government is often perceived as being more on the pro innovation side or more on the less regulation side, that it's reasonable to expect that there won't be pushing much on development specific regulation, but that's not to say that they won't consider those other regulatory models. Um, I think there's going to be a just seeing how things develop in the UK around using the criminal law system. I think that will also be the case in the US because that sort of thinking is quite transferable to the US. It's already happening in Australia, so there's already a lot of validation around using the criminal law means to sort of regulate malicious conduct. I think malicious conduct, regardless of which side or which side of the political spectrum you sit on, is something that it's easy to get consensus on, and therefore to enact regulatory action. If we're talking about civil actions and development, innovation, uh, targeted approaches, that's where you get a lot of disagreement and consensus. So I think it's a matter of shifting the understanding, which I think is already happening at the moment. I think just to as for more of like a 5-10 year sort of thinking, I think the concept of AI regulation will sort of die down in the next 5 years. I think it will still be there, but it will be talking more higher up. I think that the conversation in the next 5 years will be around digital rights, digital identity, or even the digital bill of rights. That idea is still quite early. Some countries are thinking about it. I know the US was initially thinking about digital bill of rights, also New Zealand as well. Especially, again, AI is not the only thing we should be looking at. You have to think about blockchain, metaverse, virtual reality, how all these technologies will converge into one new paradigm, one new reality. And in that new reality, we can't just focus on regulating AI. AI is going to become a small part of a bigger picture, which is going to be digital identity. How do we protect our identity? If it's possible to commercialize our identity, how do we balance that with other people's rights? I think eventually, so my thinking is that by 2026, AI regulation will start to die down as a topic and will be soon be sort of replaced by another big topic. I can go deep into this even further, but that's my prediction.
Ray, thank you so much for your answer and to this last question, but to all of them actually, and for being so extremely knowledgeable. I learned so much with everything you said. Especially, I would say I liked to your approach towards how to regulate deepfakes, and more specifically the spectrum you unveiled when it comes to transparency. I think that's just very useful, practical knowledge for us all to have. I hope my viewers all enjoyed as much as I did and learned as much as I did. So I'm looking forward to have your comments. Please, if you like the video, leave your like for us, and I see you in the next one. Ray, and for you, once again, thanks so much for being here with us. Bye-bye.